Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing wonderfully. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Sarah Posner, noted journalist in Washington, D.C. You cover religion, and in fact, you write pretty regularly for Religion Dispatches, but your byline is also seen in other places. Very recently, a New York Times op-ed, places like the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and so on. And you are the author of, I think, a book, God's Prophets. Is that right? That would
Yep.
be Profits.
That's right.
Faith, Fraud, and the Republican Crusade for Values Voters. So this is Meaning of Life TV, and as I think I warned you, I want to talk about the meaning of your life. I'm doing this, having a series of conversations with kind of journalists, notable people, asking them where they find meaning and so on. And we'll get to that. But since you are covering the presidential campaign, which involves meaning in various senses and spirituality and religion and all that, I can't resist
Go
asking
ahead.
you a little bit about that. So you had this New York Times op-ed piece noting that the conservative evangelical movement is a less monolithic thing than it used to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, did you mean just that there's no longer any one spokesperson as it happens, so it's kind of like an institutional issue? Or did you mean that evangelicals themselves agree on less than they used to, conservative evangelicals?
Well, I think that Donald Trump's candidacy has exposed rifts within the evangelical movement that were there before, but he's really brought them to the forefront, mainly because his candidacy has been so a-religious, and he's nonetheless attracted the attention of some prominent evangelicals and endorsements of prominent evangelicals. But these rifts have been there for a while. They're in part because of the evangelical movement's successes in politicizing itself. So whereas Jerry Falwell, the father of the Jerry Falwell who endorsed Trump just before the Iowa caucuses, used to be seen as the spokesperson for evangelicals. He was the guy that reporters called. What do evangelicals think about this? What does the moral majority think about this? And there isn't really that single person anymore. And that's been something that's been in progress, I guess you could say, for a while. But I think that Trump has really managed to bring this in a very visible way to non-evangelicals.
Okay. Trump himself is an interesting figure. I mean, as you note in that piece, he didn't say the things you would expect someone to say if he wanted to win the evangelical vote. He said he doesn't ask God for forgiveness. I mean, that almost inclines me to attach more credence to anything he does claim about his religious belief. That he's being so almost bizarrely candid in certain respects. I mean, do you have any kind of sense? I know it's always hard to judge from the outside. Do you have any kind of sense for his actual religious sensibility?
Well, I think that more than anything else, Donald Trump's religious sensibility has been informed by a sort of quintessentially 20th century phenomenon, which has also permeated the evangelical movement as a whole. And that is the idea of, as a child, he grew up going to Norman Vincent Peale's church. So the power of positive
I didn't
thinking.
realize that's what, Marble Collegiate or in New York?
Oh, now the name of it is escaping
I think
me.
it is.
But yeah,
I didn't know that, actually.
there was a really interesting piece written about it. I'm not remembering the author at the moment, but it was in Politico, maybe back in October. But I think that also he appeals to a segment of the evangelical world that looks upon wealth, and this was the subject of my book, by the way, that looks upon wealth as evidence of God's blessing, right? And so I think that even though he doesn't come across as pious in any way, and I don't think that he is very much of a believer in anything but himself and his own capabilities, that's a way of thinking about your good luck and your good fortune. That's really emblematic of the prosperity gospel or the word of faith movement, where your evidence that you are true to God and faithful and obeying God is that God has rewarded you with great wealth. So I think that without thinking about it in those terms, Trump has exhibited traits of that religious movement, even though I don't necessarily think that he's really thought about it quite like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So would Joel Osteen be an example of a prosperity gospel preacher that you would see on TV?
Yes. He is sort of maybe a softer version of that. I mean, the people that I wrote about in my book were people who have raised questions about whether they're defrauding their parishioners or the people who watch them on TV because of the pressure that they put on them to give money to them. And, so if you give money to your pastor, then God is going to bless you with great wealth. If you withhold it, then
God may have doubts.
God will punish you for that.
So it's like selling indulgences.
Exactly. So, so the ad that a pro-Huckabee PAC ran against Ted Cruz in Iowa just before the caucuses, I think was a little bit aimed at that way of thinking. It talked about how he had not been very generous with his tithing to his church.
Oh, right. Now, that was against Cruz or against Trump?
It was against Cruz.
It was against Cruz.
Mm.
Huh. Well, you'd think he'd know better. Cruz's father's a minister, right?
Yes. That's what made it kind of interesting.
Huh. So, but do you have a sense of, so that Trump is genuinely religious? I mean, are you always tempted to make these kinds of judgments? I mean, it must be hard. I mean, let me give you an example. I saw on Twitter, somebody said, well, how is Ben Carson still at even 10%? This was like a week ago. I was tempted to reply, I think some people probably view him as the most plausibly devout Christian in the group, and I think some people do see Ben Carson that way, right? I mean, he doesn't have some of the slickness that both Cruz and Rubio kind of have that might make you suspicious. Do you kind of have your set of guesses about who is truly devout and who is truly religious? And
yeah, I mean, I think that's something that I'm always asking myself when I'm reporting on this stuff is what does it mean to be truly religious? When I think in my own religious tradition, which is Judaism, there is a tendency to view people who are more halakhically observant to be more religious or more true to the faith. And, I think that there's a lot of dispute about that, whether that is a good measure of devotion or piety. In the Christian context, I mean, I think that you have someone like Marco Rubio attending not just one but two churches. He goes to a Catholic church and a Southern Baptist church. In a way, you could just look at that as maybe covering all his political bases.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's evidence of his piety, but I have no reason to doubt his piety, except that he's a politician and he talks about it a lot, which in and of itself makes you wonder about the authenticity of it.
Yeah.
So you see the dilemma that I frequently face.
It's hard to say from the outside. So to get back to these evangelical voters, is there anything? Do you have any kind of report on the state of the evangelical mind? It sounds like it's very hard to generalize, but do you notice, I guess, any difference in the sensibility of evangelicals compared to past presidential elections?
I think that there is a much bigger effort on the part of a certain wing of the evangelicals to make clear to the public that they're not interested in a theocracy, that they're not interested in, quote unquote, restoring the Christian nation or that sort of revisionist history that, Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers were secret theocrats. They're not interested in demonizing immigrants. They're still very much dedicated to the idea of ending abortion. They are still unhappy with the Supreme Court decision legalizing same-sex marriage, but they don't want that sort of dominionist, overtly, Christian nation, Christian nationalist mentality to permeate either their own language or the language of their preferred presidential candidate. This is a debate that is going on between, I'll roughly break it down, Rubio supporters, evangelicals who are agnostic in the primary, and people who are supporting Cruz or Trump. Obviously there are other people in the mix there. We don't know where Ben Carson's supporters are going to go. We don't know that much about the kind of evangelicals who are supporting, if any, who are supporting, someone like Kasich. I don't think he's very popular with evangelicals, or Jeb Bush. So that's the way it's breaking down right now. I think to outsiders have had a very hard time, I think, seeing the nuances of the differences between, say, a Rubio and a Cruz. When Rubio talks about his faith, his supporters say that's intended to show you that how deeply he is informed by his religious commitments when forming policy. It's not intended to impose a Christian nation on everybody else. Whereas I think that when he talks about his faith that much on the campaign trail, I think it's hard for non-evangelicals or people who aren't that tuned into these sorts of things to...
And for people listening on podcasts, we should explain that Sarah just threw something at an animal in, I think, a loving way, and I think a loving and a guiding way. The guidance was to shut the hell up, I think, is the guidance Sarah was administering to this animal.
It's actually two animals, and that's what makes it worse.
I think that's that sound I had been, yeah. I think had they been kind of like...
Let me get rid of them. Hold on.
No, they're fine. We love animals on Blogging Heads. We do not throw things at them, in fact. So much do we love them, although we leave this policy to the discretion of our guests.
So I think my Twitter followers are well aware of how much I adore these dogs, but they're being very bad.
Can you put them on camera for our viewers? Is that easy to do or not?
One is smaller than the other.
Uh-huh. Oh, what a cutie. Now,
she's not the culprit.
No, she seems very innocent. Is that a mutt or a particular breed?
They're both cardigan Welsh corgis.
Whoa, sorry, I didn't mean to insult them.
I'm not a pure breed snob. I just happen to like this one.
Yeah, I didn't mean that it looked in the least muddish. Cute dog.
Thank you. Her name is Karma.
Oh, well, how that explains the placid demeanor.
The other one is the one that's causing trouble.
Okay, so we will throw things at the other one. Okay, so good. That was good. So let's see, where were we? So here's a question before we turn to you. Maybe one more line of inquiry. There's this... I'm interested in the issue of threat. There's this premise that what makes people fundamentalists, not that all evangelicals are fundamentalists, as that
right.
term is meant, but usually
right.
meant, but there's a sense of threat, there's this idea that a sense of threat is what drives people toward fundamentalism. So that, for example, when you see Islamic fundamentalism, that might be a response to something that's in some sense a sense of threat, whether it's a sense that the U.S. is literally at war with Islam or a sense of encroaching modernity. And that's a sense that I think you see among some evangelicals in America, the sense that that the secular values are taking over America. And anyway, the thesis is, and Karen Armstrong has written about this, that a sense of threat makes people more fundamentalist. Now, first of all, is that consistent with your sense of things? And also, how are things looking on the sense of threatenedness front in the world of evangelicals?
I think that the sense of being under threat was, for them, and this is inexplicable to people who have seen the March of LGBT rights as a positive step forward for humanity. I think that evangelicals have tended to see that as a threat. I think that they've played it as a threat to Christianity or a threat to the rights of Christians to express their religious views. But it really comes from a place of feeling like they're now, that they potentially will be outnumbered on this. And, I can't, it's hard for me, and I've talked to so many evangelicals about this, but it's still, no one has persuaded me that their way of life is literally under threat because of same-sex marriage. I mean, it's, we all in our life have to interact with people with whom we profoundly disagree about things. If I own a bakery, I'm selling cakes to, all kinds of people in all likelihood, right? And probably not inquiring about, what your belief system is or what your religion is or anything. So, I just think that they haven't been very persuasive to non-evangelicals about why this is so threatening to them. I think that the rise of ISIS has heightened their sense that Islam is a threat, or in some cases they would say radical Islam is a threat, but I think for a lot of them, Islam itself is a threat. Mm-hmm. You saw that play out at Wheaton, where they let go of the professor Wheaton College, the political science professor who talked about...
She put on head covering as a sign of solidarity with Muslims, and I guess as a way of saying we all worship this, all Abrahamics worship the same God.
And she did say that all...
that was the controversial thing, right?
That was the very controversial thing to say, that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. So I think that, here is Wheaton a flagship university of evangelicalism, and also considered one that's not, it's not really considered backwards. It's considered a pretty forward-looking evangelical college. And for them to take that action, I think, shows just how skittish the evangelical world is about, about the idea of maintaining what they see as the purity of their, this is about Professor Hawkins not adhering to the university statement of faith, like that these are tenets that cannot be deviated from.
Mm-hmm. Of course, one irony is that these evangelicals could probably find a certain amount of common ground on the social issues we were just discussing with the average Muslim in the world more readily than the average mainline Christian or Jew or whatever. But
yeah, that's, for some people that's persuasive, but that is not the predominant view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why don't we, anything else you want to say about the election before we turn to the inner life of Sarah Posner?
No, but I might come back to the election when we're talking about the inner life of Sarah Posner.
As a way of evading questions? You're free to. So as I said, I've been asking various people, many of them journalists, but prominent people of various kinds, to talk a little about meaning in their life. I sometimes start by asking where they, what basic label they apply, religious, spiritual, but not religious, none of the above. Were you brought up religiously? And if so, in what sense? That kind of thing. Mm-hmm. What do you have to say on that front?
Well, I'm Jewish, as I mentioned earlier. And I was raised just sort of eclectically in terms of, going to different kinds of, Reform, conservative, Orthodox services. My family, celebrated holidays. I continue to celebrate holidays. I now go to a Reform synagogue, although, I feel like maybe it would be more perfect for me to mesh different traditions together than just have one, but, life isn't like that. Or at least, organized religious life isn't like that. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's kind of where I come from.
Now, did you say in that line of inquiry whether you actually went to synagogue regularly or anything as a kid? Or
I wouldn't say regularly, but the other piece of that is my parents took us to live in Israel for a while when I was a kid, and that was probably more influential on me than any.
Huh, that's interesting. And what was the impact? How old were you?
I was 7, and I went to second grade there at an Israeli school. We were living in Rehovot, which has a big scientific research institution there, the Weizmann Institute. So there were a lot of kids from many different countries, but, especially the United States. And so the school that I went to had, when the Israeli kids were having their grammar lesson, basically the American kids were pulled out and taught Hebrew. So I learned Hebrew pretty quickly because I was just completely immersed in it. And I was at that young age where you're a sponge for language.
And
Go ahead.
Well, did this impact your sense of Jewish identity?
Yes, but as I aged, it impacted it in different ways.
What do you mean by that?
Well, so there's an iconic story from my time living in Israel. So I was 7, so I wasn't very aware of, and it was, just to give everybody context, it was 1971. So post 1967 war, pre 1973 war. And I was going to an Israeli school, and there were a couple, my teacher didn't speak any English at all. And there were a couple of kids in the class who spoke some English because they had lived abroad. And so one day my teacher asked a boy in the class to explain to me something that was about to happen. So I remember this boy standing in front of me and, his little cherubic face. And he said, okay, the Arabs are coming. And when the principal blows the whistle, you follow everybody in the line and you go out to the playground. And then when the principal blows the whistle again, you'll go back up to the classroom in the line. And I have no idea what's happening. So the principal blows the whistle. We all file outside. And, we were just basically in the school playground. And all the kids, went to a bench and put their head, lay down and put their head under a bench. So I did that, but all the kids were horsing around. I didn't realize it was anything serious at all because they were 7. And so this was not a serious thing to them. And then, I'm waiting for something to happen. Nothing happens. The principal blows the whistle again. And we all go back to our seats. And so I have no concept of what happened. And so at dinner that night, my parents asked us, I had an older sister in the school too, what happened at school that day. And I told them, we played this game. It was called The Arabs Are Coming. And my sister just looked at me and she said, that wasn't a game. And that was when an air raid drill was explained to me. But I think that, that has sort of bothered me, in adulthood, because I think that it was so emblematic of the way that as kids, you're taught there's us and there's them. In that case, it was, and not that the threat wasn't and still isn't real of, violence by one party against the other in that part of the world. And I don't think that this was a way of thinking about that my parents instilled in me at all. Not at all. Like, this was not the way my parents presented it to me. But the idea that the only way that this little boy could explain it to me was the Arabs are coming. And so, like, as I've gotten older, I've thought about it and been sad about it because, sad that kids on both sides, have to worry about violence being inflicted on them when they're at school. And sad that that's how kids, thought about it. But I'm not sure, how else does a kid think about it? Yeah.
So when you say that has influenced your sense of Jewish identity differently as you've aged, what do you mean exactly by that? I mean, you gave me some sense of the changing perspective as you grow, but how does it influence your Jewish identity?
Well, I think that, I think my trajectory is pretty typical in the sense that I grew up in that time period. So it was just post 1967. And so there was a lot of joy and excitement among American Jews that, Israel had won the 6-Day War and, reclaimed Jerusalem, and it was very exciting. And so I don't think this was because my parents necessarily hid the other side from me, but I don't think that, I mean, I think for like a lot of Jews of their generation, they didn't start to think about the occupation until later. I mean, I think that, or at least in terms of like talking about it with me, I don't think that it was, I mean, I think they were very happy. They were sort of, kind of typical liberal progressive Zionists. And at that time, it was a happy time, like the thought that, Israel was flourishing. Mm-hmm. But, recently I went to see, oh gosh, no, I'm not remembering the title of the movie. It was a movie that recently came out where the filmmakers unearthed previously censored testimonies by soldiers who had fought in the 67 war about the terrible things that they had done. I'm not remembering the title of it. But in any case, I recently went to see that with my mother. And, I think that over the years, she too has, become anguished about the way the occupation has played out, and talked to me about, when we lived there and realizing what the occupation was about. But it was not something that she discussed with me as a child, because I think it probably would have been too complicated for me to understand.
Mm-hmm. Have you been to Israel lately?
The last time I was there was 2012.
Uh-huh. And I mean, that seems kind of a case study in how a sense of threat changes people. Right. I mean, it ebbs and flows in both Israel and maybe in the West Bank. But, I mean, don't you think... Well, I mean, you tell me. One thing that's happened in Israel is it's become, in a sense, more religious, more kind of formally religious. That's partly a demographic thing, right? There's just more ultra-Orthodox being born and so on. But, I mean, I'm told that Jerusalem is just a much less secular place than it used to be, right?
Well, when I lived there, we didn't live in Jerusalem, but when we lived in Israel, I remember one time getting a little bit lost walking around Jerusalem and ending up in an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. And I was young. I was, 7 or 8 probably at that time. And it was summer, and I was wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and, my mother was not properly covered up either. And, people threw peanut shells at us.
Really?
Yeah. So, I think that what's changed there is how the ultra-Orthodox have managed to get so much control of the government. And I think that, or at least in, control, if not necessarily of the government itself, which, obviously there is that kind of control, but also the ability to influence, basically exemptions for themselves on the basis that they're they ought to have it because they're the real, they're the real observers of Judaism. And this goes back to what we were talking about before, I mean, does that make you a better or a realer Jew than another kind of Jew?
So I take it that you would call yourself a secular Jew. Is that or is that wrong?
Well, I am an ardent secularist when it comes to government. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's any secret based on everything that I've...
There's a paper trail out there if people want to research this.
But I don't know that, I'm a secular person. I very much believe in secular government and secular politics.
Well, my follow-up question was going to be, assuming you had said yes, I was going to say, well, then, if you keep practicing the Jewish holidays, presumably you find some meaning in them, and how would you articulate that meaning? Now, that was on the assumption that you were going to say, yes, I'm kind of purely secular. It sounds like maybe it's a little more complicated than that. Yeah. Let me just go back. I mean, what about on the religious/spiritual question? Do you describe yourself as religious or not religious but spiritual, or what?
I find something so intangible about that spiritual but not religious label.
Yeah. Well,
I as a reporter also, like I have a hard time figuring out what it means.
Yeah. Well,
and I wouldn't apply it to myself.
people mean a lot of different things, like by spiritual, it turns out, and that's one of the complications. Okay, so we'll leave that question. I mean, do you consider yourself religious?
I don't, I consider myself Jewish, and that entails a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. And I think that because people have these preconceptions about what religious means, like I don't know, like I feel like if I say that, then that people would see it as, well, she must mean something by that. It must mean that, in 3 hours, she's not going to drive a car for 24 hours. We're taping this on a Friday afternoon. And that's not the case. I will probably drive a car this weekend. So, yeah.
So then tell me about the kind of meaning you get out of practicing the holidays. I mean, I gather you don't go to synagogue every Saturday. Is that right? Okay. But you do observe the holidays.
And I sometimes go to synagogue on Shabbat, but not every week.
Just not every week, but you still do go. So there's a synagogue that you're a member of.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. So what kinds of things do you get out of that? I mean, is that a source of meaning, that constellation of things, going to synagogue sometimes, observing the holidays? Is that a source of meaning in your life?
Yes, and it's a source of community and being with family and all of the above.
Mm-hmm. And is it how does it? Are there other communities where you find meaning, or is this really unique and distinctive?
Well, I think it's distinctive in that it has that religion component to it. Mm-hmm. I find community in my neighborhood, with various groups of friends that I have from various facets of life, including, journalist friends. And, but I think that, the religion component for me, is just different. But that's not to say that you can't have a similar sort of experience in conversation with people or at a different kind of event. But it is distinctive, and it is something that's important to me.
Mm-hmm. And what about your work? What kind of meaning and or sense of purpose do you get out of your work?
Well, I love writing, and I can't imagine life without writing.
So you actually enjoy, like when you sit down and you are going to write a piece, you're actually happy. You don't feel like oppressed by a deadline necessarily. You actually are looking forward to it.
Well, yes, sometimes I do feel oppressed by a deadline.
but unless it's a super oppressive deadline, you're like, oh, good, I get to write.
Yeah.
Well, you're lucky. Not all writers are like that.
I know, but I wouldn't have chosen it if that weren't the case. Mm-hmm. Because, to me, that's why I chose it. I love the act of writing. That's not to say that I haven't had times when I have writer's block or frustrations or just feeling like it's not coming. I think that happens to everyone. But in the main, this is why I chose to do this. I mean, before I was a journalist, I was a lawyer.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And the thing that I liked the most about being a lawyer was when I got to sit in my office and write a brief. Mm-hmm. I didn't very much like the rest of it. So that was the reason for the change.
And what is it about the writing? Is it like, oh, this is a nice sentence, and you would get just as much gratification out of it if you were writing fiction? Or does it have to do with, the substance or what?
It's the act of writing, the act of putting together a sentence, a paragraph, a story, whatever it is. But I also, I do like writing opinion pieces, and I like, formulating that and making an argument. But I also like writing about people and things that happen to them and how they deal with the things that happen to them.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's the old saying, I don't like writing, but I like having written. You like both.
Yes.
Wow, that is lucky. And but do you also feel any sense of purpose or sense of mission about what you do with the writing? I mean, you've chosen to write about a certain set of things. You presumably try to write about them accurately in an illuminating fashion. Is that a source of?
Yes. And I also like writing about worlds that are unfamiliar to my audience. I like that a lot. And I like writing about worlds that were at the outset unfamiliar to me. And going into that world and immersing yourself in that world, which is sometimes an act that takes place only over the course of reporting one story. But in a way, you can look at my career as an active immersion into this conservative religious world and all its various permutations that has taken place over time. And I think that to me as a journalist, that's been really valuable in terms of my ability to shed light on what's happening there and how it's changing or how it's not changing and how it's impacting important public events such as the presidential campaign.
So you're a little bit of an anthropologist.
Well, maybe not, because it's not, I don't know that, maybe.
I mean, anthropologists like exploring alien cultures.
Right.
And there's something in their perspective that I think I find in yours, which I think is laudable, which is that, on the one hand, you clearly have an ideology. You're like left of center. You spend a lot of time writing about these right of center evangelicals, but you don't do it in a kind of a snarky way. And also, I think your ideology does not impede your ability to actually understand what's going on with them. Do you know what I mean? I mean, you seem, I think you kind of give people the benefit of the doubt. I mean, you tend not to, anyway, I'll stop there. Maybe I've already gone too far. Do you think you deserve that much?
I think that that's something that has happened over time.
Uh-huh.
It takes a lot of work to be able to do that. I think that when I started writing about this, I was very concerned about infringements on the separation of church and state, which is obviously still something that, is important to me and concerns me. But I think I tended to see the world that I was writing about kind of more monolithically and as like kind of a threat to church-state separation. And I think that over time, as I've reported on it more and just, like I said, been immersed in it more, it just makes you see that everything isn't as black and white as you might have thought before you knew more about it. And there are certainly still a lot of people in that world who would like to be rid of the separation of church and state for sure. But how that happens and whether that happens is a lot more complicated, and people are a lot more complicated than, a caricature of them.
Mm-hmm. So one question I've been asking some people, I mean, especially people who don't anticipate an afterlife, and I'm assuming you don't, just because even you could be a fairly religious Jew and probably not have any kind of clear expectation of an afterlife.
Daughter of scientists.
Yeah, so that further dims your prospects of winding up in heaven.
Right.
By the way, though, do even Orthodox Jews tend to talk about an afterlife?
I'm not that familiar with, because the way I grew up and the way it's just not a thing, I mean, so
I think certainly for most of American Judaism, so far as I can tell, it's not a thing.
Right.
which is interesting because people often say, well, one of the main services religion functions is to console people about the prospect of their death by telling them that there's, something beyond. But this is a religion that seems not to do that.
Well, can I add something about that?
Sure.
I think that the Jewish mourning rituals are extremely comforting without promising an afterlife.
Well, elaborate on that. What do they involve, and how do they work? Why are they so effective?
I don't know. But when my father died, which was a little over 3 years ago, I hadn't really gone through a mourning ritual for someone close to me. So, I mean, it's not like there hadn't been people who had died, but it wasn't never somebody, like that. And I don't know what it was. Of course, I'd said Kaddish before, but it made me focus on what it really means to, remember the memory of someone and have that memory still be with you and with your community, and to recall that with your community. And so it was very, I don't know. It was just, it was very important and crucial for me, actually, in the grieving process.
And what does saying Kaddish involve? What does that mean? I know Leanne Wieseltier wrote a book called Kaddish, right, about the death of his own father. Is that right?
Oh, I've never read it, but so it's at the conclusion of almost every service, and it's just a recognition that the community, you say it in a group. It's a prayer that you say together, and remembering the dead, and that people are grieving for the dead, but that it's that the person's life is a memory, that their memory is a blessing, and I just found it very comforting, and maybe it's because I don't believe in an afterlife, so I needed something to latch onto, and this was it. But to me, it was like a beautiful thing to just like talk about it in those terms, that like the person's memory is a blessing to you and a blessing to everyone who knew him, and that like as a community you remember that person and other people.
And does having gone through this influence the the equanimity or whatever with which you can anticipate your own eventual demise, or do you not anticipate your own eventual demise?
Well, I have thought about that. Probably like most people, you think about it and then you think, I don't want to think about that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm trying to think of other parts of your interior life I can probe, but I think we've covered a fair amount of ground. But maybe we should end the way we started and just ask you a question about Democratic politics. There's not nearly as much God talk on the Democratic side. I mean, this is generally true, probably, as on the Republican side, right? Hillary, I think you wrote a piece recently about something Hillary said about her Methodist upbringing. But is in your view, is religion just in no sense much of a factor on the Democratic side?
I think it's a factor for some Democratic voters, but they don't want to hear about it in the same way that Republican voters do, right? And so I think over the course of her career, Clinton has, sometimes tiptoed around it depending on the audience, embraced it depending on the audience. She's pretty comfortable talking about her sort of brand of liberal Christianity. And, she was asked that question the other night at the town hall by the rabbi, the question about ambition and humility, which I actually think she didn't answer that well. It was a very rabbinic question, this sort of like balancing of like, you're very ambitious. How do you balance that with,
What did she say?
She said that it's something that she struggles with, the balancing of ambition and humility. It was a good question because I think it's a tough question for any politician to answer. If you are running for president of the United States, how much is humility a factor? I mean, in all honesty.
Although, as Donald Trump has shown, there are degrees. There's such a thing as having zero.
Yeah, well, he's set that, the bar at a different place. But I just think that the share of Democratic vote, the largest segment, when you look at the religious demographics of the Democratic Party, the largest segment is the religiously unaffiliated. Mm-hmm. So, they have to realize that, their base doesn't probably want to hear this kind of talk. And then the question is, how much marginal benefit are you going to get from engaging in that kind of talk by peeling away, moderate, independent, maybe, less conservative Republicans? And the answer is probably, very marginal.
Uh-huh. And do you have a sense or a guess on how religious, if at all, Hillary actually is?
I think, here we go again.
Yeah, I know.
I think she's sincere. She did grow up Methodist.
Right.
I've talked to people who spent a lot of time around her, and they really do think that she's that she's devoted to her religion. I mean, there's no, I think there's little evidence in her career that she sought out religion in order to make a political point. I mean, she is definitely a lifelong Methodist. But, is she really religious? Does a really religious person take a $300,000 speaking fee from Goldman Sachs? That was maybe a low blow. I don't know. But, but you see what I'm saying? It's like if you say that your religion is this liberal Christianity that, cares for the least of these.
Right. Of course, we all convince ourselves that ultimately we're working for the greater good. We have to make a living. We blah, blah, blah. You know how that goes.
Right.
I mean, all of us, really, all of us.
Again.
What's that?
There are degrees, again.
There are degrees. And I've got to say, I've never gone so far as to justify getting $300,000 for giving a talk, but there's a reason for that. I've never had to justify it. I'm sure I could. Okay. Well, listen, thanks for submitting to my interrogation. I encourage people to read your stuff on Religion Dispatches. Also follow you on Twitter. What's your actual Twitter handle again?
Just my name.
Just your name.
Mm-hmm.
Well, lucky you. You must have gotten in early. There's got to be a fair number of Sarah Posners, right?
Yes.
But you were in the Twitter game early.
And I also own the domain name sarahposner.com.
Whoa. Aren't we ahead of the curve? Well, that's good.
If you want to see all my writing, it's all there. So
okay. So they can go there too. And I encourage all that. So thank you again, Sarah.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay. Take care.